Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the incredibly complex, honestly kind of mind-boggling paradox of modern Chechnya. Geographically, it's this rugged, mountainous region straddling the Caucasus, roughly the size of Slovenia. Technically, it's a republic of the Russian Federation. But practically, it's a whole different story. It operates with almost medieval defiance to Moscow, functioning completely like a state within a state.
So here's the massive contradiction we're trying to figure out today. How exactly did an ethnic population that fought tooth and nail against Russian subjugation for centuries become this heavily militarized, hyper-autonomous regime that's unconditionally loyal to Vladimir Putin? I mean, how does a whole society make a pivot like that? And honestly, what does it mean for the rest of us?
To make sense of this, we're going to map out a historical timeline spanning centuries. We'll be looking at the roots of resistance, the First Chechen War, the Interwar period, the Second Chechen War, and finally, the Compromise.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the deep historical roots of Chechen resistance.
To really understand the modern era, you have to look at the timeline of Chechen independence movements, which is basically this brutal, repeating cycle of rebellion and suppression. Starting way back in the 18th century, the Russian Empire spent decades trying to absorb the Chechens. Fast forward to 1917, during the Russian Civil War, and Chechnya actually grabbed a brief moment of independence as the Mountain Republic before the Bolsheviks violently crushed it. But the real trauma, the absolute turning point, is 1944. Joseph Stalin baselessly accused the entire Chechen population of collaborating with the Nazis and just forcefully deported them all to Central Asia. We're talking about a third of the population dying in what the European Parliament recognizes as an act of genocide. That horrific trauma bred a deep, entrenched resentment that finally exploded when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Chechnya declared independence all over again.
Which brings us to Section 2, the First Chechen War.
Now, because Russia was dealing with its own chaotic collapse in the early 90s, Chechnya actually got away with a few years of unbothered autonomy. But in late 1994, Moscow finally came knocking. They expected a quick, easy victory. They had the tech, they had the numbers. Instead, it devolved into this grinding 20-month nightmare. It literally became the most ferocious war fought in Europe since World War II. The death toll is just staggering. An estimated 100,000 Chechen civilians died. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 10% of the entire population at the time. Unable to easily crush the insurgency, Russia just resorted to absolute devastation. I mean, they used overwhelming artillery to completely flatten cities like the capital, Grozny. They set up filtration camps, which, let's be honest, functioned essentially as concentration camps, and ran brutal cleansing operations involving collective reprisals against communities. But here's the thing. Instead of forcing a surrender, that overwhelming brutality just fueled an even more stubborn, fanatical resistance. Eventually, by August 1996, with Russian casualties mounting and domestic support totally crashing, Russia had to pull out. They left behind a de facto independent state, but a society that was completely shattered.
That leads right into Section 3, the interwar period.
This is where things take a really dark turn. The fundamental nature of the independence movement started to mutate. You have this ruined, traumatized society that basically became a failed state. And that power vacuum became incredibly fertile ground for foreign jihadists flocking in from across the Islamic world. So you see this violent shift from a secular Chechen nationalist movement into something entirely different, an extreme Taliban-style interpretation of Sharia law. Now, there were people completely horrified by this radical shift, including a powerful warlord named Ramzan Kadyrov. He was Chechnya's Grand Mufti, or religious leader. As a more moderate Muslim who had actually fought the Russians in the First War, he grew deeply, deeply disillusioned with this new radical Islamist direction his country was taking. And, this disillusionment, it's a massive pivot point that ended up altering European history.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Section 4, the Second Chechen War.
Fast forward to 1999, and a newly rising Vladimir Putin vows to succeed where his predecessors humiliatingly failed. And he does it using a highly pragmatic three-step strategy. First, he recognized and exploited those internal divisions that had fractured Chechen society. Second, he reached out to disillusioned figures like Ramzan Kadyrov and made an offer. Switch sides, drop the whole independence thing. Third, they team up to crush the rival radical Islamist factions together. In exchange, Kadyrov and his allies become the territory's new, undisputed ruling class.
And that brings us to Section 5, the Compromise.
By May 2000, Russia had re-established control, forging this dark, incredibly fragile pact. Putin rewarded the Kadyrovs by making them the new leaders. But they had to do the dangerous, bloody job of counterinsurgency, wiping out the remaining radicals so Russian soldiers didn't have to. To pull this off, the Kadyrov family was allowed to build the Kadyrovsi. This is a massive private army of up to 70,000 heavily armed men. Just think about that scale. That's almost 1 in 10 men in Chechnya. It makes it one of the most heavily militarized societies on the planet. And here's the absolute kicker. They swear personal military fealty to the Kadyrov family, not to the Russian state.
After Ahmad Kadyrov was assassinated in 2004, his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, eventually took power. Under Ramzan, Chechnya morphed into Europe's sole remaining totalitarian regime. According to the source data, this is a regime that systematically uses torture, conducts forced disappearances, and runs brutal purges of the LGBT community. Plus, sources show Ramzan uses his forces for targeted assassinations of critics globally, and he operates completely outside Russian federal law with total impunity. Why? Because the Kremlin tolerates it, as long as Ramzan keeps that long history of separatism firmly suppressed.
So, you might be asking yourself, how on earth does Kadyrov pay for a 70,000-man private army and his regime? Well, the financial breakdown tells the story. It's essentially an enormous, multi-billion-dollar bribe for loyalty. Roughly 80% of Chechnya's entire financial resources come directly from Russian federal subsidies. And because the line between the government and the Kadyrov family is basically non-existent, these funds are heavily embezzled, fueling Ramzan's opulent lifestyle of private jets, exotic zoos, and supercars. And right now, we're seeing that bought loyalty repaid on the battlefield. Openly calling himself Putin's foot soldier, Kadyrov has deployed tens of thousands of his private troops into the invasion of Ukraine. Using all that brutal counterinsurgency experience, they act as ruthless rearguard forces. They're tasked with suppressing Ukrainian partisans and reportedly enforcing harsh discipline, like summary executions, on deserting Russian troops. So, we've watched Chechnya evolve from a republic fiercely fighting for its independence into a totalitarian fiefdom operating as an extension of one man's will. But here is the most crucial takeaway for us. It is all incredibly fragile. This entire state within a state relies completely on a personal, medieval-style bond between two aging men, Vladimir Putin and Ramzan Kadyrov. It's not built on laws or democratic institutions. So we're left with a terrifying question. What sort of chaos or reignited war erupts when this brutal compromise finally breaks and one of these men leaves the stage? It's a geopolitical time bomb just waiting to go off. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helps you wrap your head around the deeply complex reality of the Caucasus.